Well, hello, I'm Steve Hudson. I'm here doing the lesson for May 8th for the Friendship Sunday School class at Jasper First United Methodist Church. We've got an abbreviated lesson this morning. We're having a reception for our youth pastor who is leaving us and going to a church in North Carolina. And so this is going to be rather a short lesson. I know you've heard that from me before, and it didn't happen, but I promise you that's really what's happening today. Our lesson today comes from Deuteronomy chapter 14, which the overall chapter is basically about living all of your life for God and dedicating your life to Him and putting Him first. Our lesson is really on one aspect of that. I'll give you just some overview leading up to it. And basically, in Old Testament language, this is kind of the way that they go about doing this is by separating themselves from the pagan nations in which they are fixing to be in amongst as they have left Egypt and are going to the Promised Land. The principle behind all this is found in chapter 14, verse 2. It says, "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for Himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." So what does holy mean? Holy means essentially separated or set apart. They are people set apart for God, by God. And He's expecting them to maintain a relationship primarily with Him and not get sucked into all the temptations of the pagan nations around them. There's a lot of language leading up to our scripture today about the foods, and that's real interesting, the foods that they can eat and not eat. We've all heard of kosher foods and unkosher foods for Jewish people. I'll just hit some high points. There's a lot of details here that I'm not going to bog the lesson down with. In terms of mammals, it's only certain mammals that can be eaten. And the simple rule is if it's got a cloven hoof or a split hoof and chews cud, you can eat it. You know, that means things like cattle and sheep and goats. Animals like rabbits, for instance, were not kosher because they didn't have hooves, and of course they don't chew their cud. So that's just an example. That kind of covers the mammals. Only certain sea creatures could be eaten. Basically, fish could be eaten because the rule was anything that had scales and fins you could eat. Well, that's almost every fish. Obviously, that wouldn't include things like catfish or sharks. And interestingly enough, all your shellfish are eliminated. You can't have any lobster tails with your steak. So that may explain why I'm not Jewish. I don't know. Clean birds can be eaten. Now, there's not a written rule of thumb here, but when you read through, it's got a long list of what can and can't be eaten. And essentially what you see is that birds of prey, hawks, owls, things like that are not edible, and birds that are scavengers, vultures, things like that are not edible, and all other birds are edible. And just a general overarching rule is that they cannot eat anything that dies on its own. In other words, if they find a dead animal, they can, even if it was a kosher animal, they couldn't devour it. And the reason for that dealt with the blood. If it's not been properly bled, it was unkosher. And it was important to the Jewish people to bleed animals before they were prepared as food, because the blood represented the life principle of the animal, and the life principle of the animal belonged to God and God alone. So they could not eat an animal that had died and not been properly bled. So basically what all these food rules were a statement, again, of separation from all the pagan nations. In that society, a lot like ours today, dining together was a real bonding process, and this made it, frankly, a little more difficult for them to intermingle around the table with the pagan people, and therefore kind of inhibited those relationships and the temptation to become more like the pagan. So that was kind of the overarching rule behind all that. Our main thrust of the lesson today really starts in verses 22 and 23, and it's one of your favorite subjects. It's about tithing. Preachers rarely talk about this because it's not popular, but I don't depend on the church for my paycheck, so I'm pretty free to talk about it. Verse 22 says, starting in verse 22, it says, "You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain and your new wine and your oil and the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." I find that first phrase really interesting. You shall truly tithe. I think the emphasis here is on the word truly. It's important because the tithe in some of the in-between verses there that I didn't take time to read is described as 10%. And what he's saying here is you shall truly tithe 10%. Now you can imagine the myriad of ways that the Israeli people could find to kind of justify cheating that or cutting corners on that, but the command here is to truly tithe. Don't take any shortcuts, but truly tithe, and it should really be a true 10%. And it says tithe all the increase of your grain. And this meant, in that day, the grain left over after the seed grain was taken out of the harvest. Remember, these are farmers. This is a agrarian society. They harvest a wheat crop. Well, they have a certain amount of grain, and they have to take a certain amount of that grain out and set it aside as seed for next year's crop, or else they won't have any. And what this is saying is you tithe on what's left after you take out your seed crop. This is the modern day equivalent of saying, people say, well, I tithe on my net income, not my gross income. The government gets all kind of taxes and everything, and I don't tithe on money that I don't get. And this would, in my mind, this justifies that, and it's an appropriate way to look at that, because that's what God told him to do. You don't tithe on what you are not truly, eating and using. You shall eat before the Lord, and when the tithe was delivered before the tabernacle, they would do a little ceremonial quote meal thing where with the Levite priests and stuff, where they were enjoyed a ceremonial type meal ceremony. So that that was just, again, part of the ritual, and the remainder was given to the priests for them to use. Remember, the Levites were the priests, and the Levites didn't own land, so they didn't farm. They depended on everybody else's gifts to support them and their families as they went about all the rituals that were required in that day. And then the real key here, it says that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. This was the purpose of tithing. This is the bottom line of doing the tithe, to build an honor and reverence for God always. The paraphrase, if you read the Living Bible, puts it really well. That's not the interpretation I normally use, but in this case I think it states it well. And it's real plain. It says, the purpose of tithing is to teach you always to put God first in your lives. I mean, that's about as plain and simple as you can put it, and that says it very well. And then we got some verses 24 through 27 that address long distance tithing. It says, "But if the journey is too long for you, so that you are not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, when the Lord your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. And you shall spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep or wine or similar drink or whatever your heart desires. You shall eat there before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. You shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you." So here, where it talks about if the journey's too long for you, they did all this in a central place at the tabernacle, later on at the temple. And if it was too far for since everybody in the nation was coming there, some people were close, but a lot of people were far away, and it wasn't practical to carry the firstborn lamb or whatever. And so they basically converted that to money and brought that, and then bought what they needed in order to do the tithe of whatever it is they were tithing on. And they exchanged it for money, and when they came to the tabernacle and later the temple, they converted it into something that worked better. Laws like this just show that the God is a practical God, and he understands the limitations that we live with, and he works with us on those things. And then there's some language in here about the third year tithe. At the end of every third year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. And the Levites, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow who are in your gates may come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. If you read up on this, there's some scholars that have suggested this might have been another tithe, an additional tithe in the third year. From what I read, most of them think actually this is just the same tithe that you're always doing, but every third year it's just distributed and put in a little bit different direction. So, in other words, every 3 years the tithe was available not just to the Levites and the priests, but to the poor, the fatherless, all the neglected people, to help sustain them until next time. So it's basically one basic tithe, but it was put to various uses, just like when we tithe here at the church. Some of it goes to salary, some of it goes to buildings, some of it goes to missions. It's just, still the same tithe, but it goes to different uses. And now I've been talking about Old Testament stuff here, and it's important to understand that the tithing is not a principle that's dependent on Mosaic law. Hebrews chapter 7, verses 5 through 9 explain that tithing was practiced way before Mosaic law was ever put into effect or God gave the law. So it preceded Moses. You'll also, and I have heard it said very often, that tithing is not commanded or in the New Testament. And although it's certainly looked upon very favorably, that it's not commanded. I would take issue with that, and I'm going to read a verse from you here and tell you why I think this. This is from Matthew 23. It's easy to remember, Matthew 23:23. And if just to give you some context, this is Matthew 23 is probably the most scathing rebuke Jesus gives to the Pharisees and the scribes in the Bible. I mean, it's just one blow after another, and he really dresses them down and spares no language in doing so. It's a strong rebuke of them and their practices. So reading in verse 23, listen carefully. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites." Listen to this. "For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, and mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. So listen to what he says here. He says, you scribes and Pharisees, you're hypocrites. You pay your tithes. And he mentions what they used back then to pay the tithes. And then he comes back and he says, and you should do that. You should tithe. That's Jesus right here saying directly, you should tithe. Y'all did that and you should do it. But you're neglecting the weightier matters of love and faith and kindness. And he said you should do the tithes, but you should also do these other things. So he does directly address tithing, and that's obviously in Matthew is in the New Testament. So don't let anybody tell you that the New Testament does not address tithing, because it does. It addresses it directly, and it's none other than Jesus himself who does it. So when we talk about tithing, let me put this in another sense. Let's say that I'm going to take a journey, and I'm going away for a while. And I don't know how long I'm going to be gone. I just know I'm going to be gone for a while. And I want to make sure while I'm gone that my bride is taken care of. So I get three of my buddies, and I say, George, Banny, Jim, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send each of you $10,000 a month while I'm gone. George, you get $10,000. Banny, you get $10,000. Jim, you get $10,000. I'm going to send it to you every month. And I want each of you to take 10% of that, $1,000, and give to my bride every month to make sure she's taken care of while I'm gone, for however long that is. And they say, okay. Well, I'm gone a few months, and I check in, and I'm talking to Deb and said, well, how's it going? Are my guys taking care of you? She said, oh, yeah, George, every month he sends me $1,000. And in fact, he's got it set up on an automatic withdrawal. The first of every month, I get a $1,000 check deposited into my account. So he's been true and faithful, and I appreciate him doing that. I said, what about Banny? She said, oh, yeah, Banny's great. In fact, he's been sending $2,000 every month. It's not on the same day every month, but I get it every month. So he's been exceedingly faithful. Well, that's good. That's what I wanted. That pleases me greatly. I said, what about Jim? He said, well, Jim, it's, he sent $800 the first month, and the next month he sent $500, and so far, I hadn't heard from him since then. So what do you think I'm going to do when I come back? I'm going to take the resources that I gave to Jim and distribute them among George and Banny, because they've been faithful. Now, think of this in these terms. Those buddies of mine were taking care of my bride. The New Testament, who does it describe as the bride of Christ? Who is the bride of Christ? Read in Revelation when the coming of the New Jerusalem and the wedding of the Lamb. Who is the bride of the Lamb? And of course, the Lamb is Jesus Christ. It's the church. The Bible is very clear. It's the church. So in effect, God is sending us $10,000 a month. And he's saying, I want you to tithe and take care of my bride, the church. Just like I wanted my buddies to take care of my bride, Deb, while I was gone. He's saying, I'm gone right now, but I'm coming back. And I'm giving you this resource, and I want you to use it to take care of my bride till I come back. Are you doing that? Are you George? Are you Banny? Are you Jim? Where are you? People don't understand tithing. They think tithing is a financial issue. It has nothing to do with finances. Tithing is a spiritual issue. Now, you may not want to look at it that way, because you may look in there and find some things that you don't want to see. But tithing is a real quick peek into what's your spiritual life and your condition is, and what your priorities are, and what your relationship to God is. That's kind of a Cliff Notes version of your spiritual condition. Tithing's a good indicator of that. Think of it that way, because he's coming back, and he's going to see who's been taking care of his bride. Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for trusting us to take care of your bride, the church, until you come again. And you've been very explicit in asking us to do that. And you blessed us with the ability to do that. However much or little the world thinks it is, we know what you think of it. And we thank you for blessing us so that we can be a blessing to others. We ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen.